Henry Caldwell's polished shoes clicked against the marble floor of his office building as he strode towards the exit, his eyes darting nervously to the darkening sky outside. The weather report had warned of a severe storm approaching New York City, but he hadn't anticipated it would hit so soon. As he pushed through the revolving door, the first fat droplets of rain splattered against his expensive suit. "Damn it," he muttered, quickening his pace. The wind picked up, whipping his tie into his face as he jogged down the sidewalk. Within seconds, the skies opened up, unleashing a torrential downpour that had pedestrians scattering for cover. Henry ducked under the awning of a nearby building, shaking the water from his hair. He glanced at his watch, realizing with frustration that he'd be stuck here for a while. As he leaned against the wall, a flash of movement caught his eye. Huddled in the corner of the doorway, shivering violently, was a young woman. Her clothes were soaked through, her dark hair plastered to her pale face. Despite her bedraggled appearance, there was something about her that made Henry pause. Her eyes, when they met his, held a spark of intelligence that seemed at odds with her current state. Henry hesitated, his hand halfway to his pocket where he kept a few dollar bills for situations like these. But something made him stop. Maybe it was the way she held herself, or the quiet dignity in her gaze. Before he could second-guess himself, he heard his own voice saying, "Do you need help?" The woman looked up, surprise evident on her face. I'm okay," she stammered, her teeth chattering. Henry sighed, already regretting what he was about to do. "Look, I live just a few blocks from here. You can come dry off, at least until the storm passes." She stared at him, clearly weighing her options. After a moment, she nodded slowly and stood up, revealing herself to be taller than he'd initially thought. "I'm Henry," he said, extending his hand. "Emily," she replied, her grip surprisingly firm despite her trembling. They made a dash through the rain, arriving at Henry's building soaked but laughing from the absurdity of their sprint. The doorman eyed Emily suspiciously as they entered, but Henry's nod seemed to placate him. As the elevator ascended to the penthouse, Henry found himself studying Emily's reflection in the mirrored walls. Despite her disheveled appearance, there was an undeniable grace to her posture, a refinement that seemed out of place for someone he'd found on the street. The doors opened directly into Henry's apartment, and he couldn't help but smile at Emily's sharp intake of breath. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, now obscured by sheets of rain. "The bathroom's down the hall," Henry said, gesturing. "There are clean towels in the cabinet. I'll find you some dry clothes." Emily nodded gratefully and disappeared down the hallway. Henry quickly changed out of his wet suit, then rummaged through his closet for something that might fit his unexpected guest. When Emily emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a fluffy white towel, Henry handed her a stack of clothes. "They might be a bit big, but they're dry," he said with a shrug. "Thank you," Emily replied, her voice soft but clear. "You're very kind." As she changed, Henry busied himself in the kitchen, putting on a pot of coffee and assembling a quick meal from the contents of his fridge. When Emily returned, dressed in his oversized sweatpants and t-shirt, he couldn't help but notice how the clothes seemed to swallow her slender frame. They ate in silence for a few minutes before Henry's curiosity got the better of him. "So, Emily," he began, "what's your story?" Emily's eyes flickered up to meet his, then quickly returned to her plate. "It's complicated," she said finally. Henry nodded, not pressing further. As they finished eating, Emily's gaze wandered to the bookshelves lining one wall of the living room. "You have an impressive collection," she remarked, standing to examine the titles more closely. "You're familiar with Proust?" Henry asked, surprised, as Emily ran her fingers along the spine of a well-worn copy of In Search of Lost Time. "I studied literature in college," she replied, a hint of sadness in her voice. Before Henry could inquire further, his phone buzzed. It was Carol, his assistant. "Henry," her voice came through, tight with concern. "Are you all right? The storm is getting worse." "I'm fine, Carol," he assured her. "I made it home safely." There was a pause. "Is someone there with you?" Carol asked, her tone sharp. Henry glanced at Emily, who was still perusing his bookshelf. "I'll explain later," he said quietly. "Don't worry." As he hung up, a memory flashed unbidden through his mind. Michael, his former business partner, laughing as he signed away their company, leaving Henry with nothing. The familiar ache of betrayal twisted in his gut. The storm outside began to subside, the pounding rain softening to a gentle patter against the windows. Emily turned from the bookshelf, her expression uncertain. "I should go," she said, moving towards the door. Henry found himself speaking before he'd fully formed the thought. "You could stay," he offered, surprising himself. "Just until the weather clears completely." Emily hesitated, her hand on the doorknob. For a moment, Henry thought she would refuse. Then, slowly she nodded. As Emily settled onto the couch for the night, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made a decision that would change everything. He watched her from the doorway of his bedroom, her eyes already closing in exhaustion. There was something in her gaze, a glimmer of something he couldn't quite place, that made him wonder if his impulsive offer of shelter had been wise or dangerously naive. Henry woke up with a start, the memory of Emily's gleaming eyes from the night before still fresh in his mind. He quickly got out of bed, his heart racing as he made his way to the living room to check if she was still there. To his surprise and relief, he found Emily in the kitchen, expertly preparing breakfast. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air as Henry entered the kitchen. Emily turned to him with a warm smile, her culinary skills clearly on display. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell. I hope you don't mind, but I thought I'd make us some breakfast as a thank you for your kindness." Henry was taken aback by her thoughtfulness and skill. "This is unexpected." "Thank you, Emily. And please call me Henry." As they sat down to eat, Henry couldn't help but notice how at ease Emily seemed in his luxurious apartment. Her manners were impeccable, and her conversation was intelligent and engaging. Yet, there was still an air of mystery about her that Henry couldn't quite shake. After breakfast, Henry went to his room to get ready for work. He reached for his favorite watch, a vintage Rolex that had been a gift from his late father. To his dismay, it wasn't in its usual spot. He searched frantically, but the watch was nowhere to be found. Just as Henry was about to ask Emily if she had seen it, the elevator dinged, announcing Carol's arrival. His assistant strode in, her eyes immediately darting to Emily, who was tidying up the kitchen. "Henry, a word?" Carol said, her tone clipped and professional. She led him to his home office, closing the door behind them. "I hope you know what you're doing," she hissed. "Taking in a stranger off the street? Have you lost your mind?" Henry sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Carol, I appreciate your concern, but I'm a grown man. I can make my own decisions. Need I remind you what happened with Michael?" Carol's words hit Henry like a punch to the gut. The betrayal of his former business partner was still a raw wound. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Emily poked her head in, her expression apologetic. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I was wondering if there's anything I can do to help around the apartment? It's the least I can do to repay your kindness." Henry smiled, grateful for the interruption. "That's very kind of you, Emily. Perhaps you could help organize the living room? I've been meaning to do it for ages." As Emily left to start her task, Carol shot Henry a warning look before departing for the office. Henry tried to shake off his unease, telling himself he was just being paranoid. Later that evening, as Henry was showing Emily his prized art collection, he noticed something odd. A valuable Ming vase that usually sat on a pedestal in the corner was missing. His heart rate quickened, but he forced himself to remain calm. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, especially after Emily had been so helpful throughout the day. That night, as Henry lay in bed, his mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Emily's refined manners and willingness to help didn't align with his growing suspicions. He thought back to his conversation with Carol, her warnings echoing in his head. The next morning, Henry received a mysterious phone call. He stepped out onto the balcony to take it, his voice low and urgent. When he returned, he found Emily studying an old photograph of him and Michael that sat on his bookshelf. She quickly put it down when she noticed him, but not before Henry caught a flicker of recognition in her eyes. Unable to contain his suspicions any longer, Henry decided to confront Emily. "Emily," he began, his voice strained, "I've noticed that some items have gone missing since you arrived. My watch, a vase. I hate to ask, but do you know anything about this?" Emily's eyes widened in shock and hurt. Mr. Caldwell, Henry, I would never steal from you. How could you think that after everything? Tears welled up in her eyes, and Henry immediately felt a pang of guilt. As Emily retreated to the guest room, clearly upset, Carol arrived. She found Henry looking distressed in the living room. "What's wrong?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. Henry explained the situation, and Carol's expression hardened. "I told you this was a bad idea," she said. "We need to do something. Why don't we install some security cameras? Just to be safe." Henry hesitated, the idea of secretly filming his guest making him uncomfortable. But as he glanced towards the guest room where Emily had disappeared, he nodded slowly. "All right," he said, "but let's be discreet about it." That night, after Emily had gone to bed, Henry carefully installed a small, hidden camera in the living room. As he stepped back to ensure it was unnoticeable, he couldn't help but feel a mix of guilt and anticipation. Later, as Henry sat in his dimly lit study reviewing the camera footage, his heart nearly stopped. There on the screen, clear as day, was a familiar figure rummaging through his belongings. But it wasn't Emily. Henry's heart raced as he rewatched the security camera footage for the third time. There, clear as day, was Carol, his trusted assistant, rummaging through his belongings. He felt a mix of anger and betrayal wash over him. How could she do this? And more importantly, why? The next morning, Henry struggled to maintain his composure during breakfast with Emily. He caught himself stealing glances at her, searching for any sign of deceit or guilt. But all he saw was a young woman who seemed genuinely grateful for his hospitality. As Carol arrived at the apartment, Henry's stomach churned. He watched her every move, noticing how she casually greeted Emily while shooting furtive glances around the room. It was as if he was seeing her for the first time, and he didn't like what he saw. Emily, perceptive as ever, picked up on the change in Henry's demeanor. She became more reserved, her eyes darting between Henry and Carol, sensing the tension in the air. Unable to contain himself any longer, Henry asked Carol to join him in his home office. As soon as the door closed behind them, he confronted her. "Carol, I know what you've been doing. I saw you on the security cameras. Why are you stealing from me?" Carol's face paled, but she quickly composed herself. "Henry, I don't know what you're talking about. Are you feeling all right?" Before Henry could respond, there was a commotion in the living room. He rushed out, Carol close behind, to find Michael standing in the doorway. Henry's ex-business partner, the man who had betrayed him years ago, was now in his home. Well, Michael sneered. "I see you haven't learned your lesson about trusting the wrong people, Henry." Henry's mind reeled. "What are you doing here, Michael?" Michael's eyes darted to Emily, who had shrunk back against the wall. "I'm here to warn you about the little con artist you've taken in. Emily, isn't it? Or should I say Sarah? Or perhaps Jessica?" Emily's eyes widened in shock and fear. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered. "Oh, don't play innocent," Michael spat. "I know all about your scams. You've been working your way through the city's elite, haven't you? And now you've set your sights on poor, gullible Henry." Henry felt as if the ground was shifting beneath his feet. He looked at Emily, searching for any sign that Michael was lying. But all he saw was fear in her eyes. "Henry, please," Emily pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't listen to him. He's lying." But the seed of doubt had been planted. Henry's mind raced back to all the missing items, the vague answers about her past, the convenient story of homelessness. Had he been fooled again? As if sensing Henry's internal struggle, Carol stepped forward. "I told you, Henry. I warned you about taking in strays." The room erupted into chaos. Michael continued hurling accusations at Emily, while Carol tried to console Henry. Emily, tears streaming down her face, began gathering her few belongings. "I can't believe I trusted you," Henry said, his voice hollow. I thought you were different." Emily's face crumpled in pain and disappointment. "And I thought you were different too, Henry. I guess we were both wrong." With that, she rushed past them all and out the door. Henry made a half-hearted attempt to stop her, but she pushed him away, her eyes filled with hurt and anger. As the door slammed shut behind Emily, the apartment fell into an eerie silence. Henry turned to face Carol and Michael, his mind slowly piecing together the puzzle. You two are working together, aren't you? He asked, his voice dangerously low. Carol's composure finally cracked. Henry, you have to understand. After what Michael told me about your company, about the deals you made, Deals I made? Henry interrupted, his anger rising. You mean the deals Michael fabricated to push me out of my own company? Michael's smug expression faltered. Now, Henry, let's not get carried away. Business is business, after all. But Henry wasn't listening anymore. He lunged at Michael, years of pent-up rage exploding in a flurry of fists. They grappled, knocking over furniture and shattering a vase. Carol screamed, trying to separate them. When they finally broke apart, all three were panting heavily. Henry's lip was bleeding, and Michael's I was already starting to swell. Get out, Henry growled. Both of you, get out of my home and stay out of my life. As Carol and Michael scurried out, Henry was left alone in the wreckage of his apartment. He picked up the mug Emily had been using that morning, running his thumb over the chip in its rim. The weight of his mistake crashed down on him. Emily was gone, disappeared into the vastness of New York City, and he had let her go, choosing to believe the worst instead of trusting his instincts. As Henry contemplated the chaos his life had become, his phone rang. It was an unknown number. He answered hesitantly, and a gruff voice on the other end said, I know where Emily is, and you need to hear her out. Henry's fingers trembled as he ended the mysterious call, his mind racing with the newfound information about Emily's whereabouts. Without a second thought, he grabbed his coat and rushed out of his apartment, ignoring the incessant ringing of his phone. Carol and Michael's names flashing on the screen. The streets of New York were a blur as Henry made his way to the Lower East Side, the area mentioned by the anonymous informant. His heart pounded with a mixture of hope and anxiety as he scanned the faces of every passerby, searching for any sign of Emily. His first stop was a local shelter, a place he'd never set foot in before. The stark reality of homelessness hit him as he walked through the doors, the air heavy with desperation and lost dreams. Henry pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking slightly as he showed Emily's photo to the staff and residents. Yeah, I've seen her around, a gruff voice said. Henry turned to face an older man with weathered features. She usually hangs out near that old bakery on Orchard Street. Sweet girl, always willing to lend a hand. Henry's heart leaped at this information. He thanked the man and rushed out, his feet carrying him swiftly towards Orchard Street. As he approached the abandoned bakery, a sense of sadness washed over him. The once vibrant storefront was now a shell of its former self, windows boarded up and paint peeling. Peering through a crack in the plywood, Henry's mind conjured an image of Emily, happily working in her bakery before the fire that destroyed everything. He could almost smell the aroma of freshly baked bread and hear the cheerful chatter of customers. Determined to learn more, Henry approached a nearby shop. The elderly owner's eyes lit up with recognition when he mentioned Emily's name. Ah, Emily. Such a tragedy what happened to her bakery, the old man sighed. She put her heart and soul into that place. The fire took everything, her business, her home, her dreams. We all tried to help, but she just disappeared one day. Henry's chest tightened as he listened to the story of Emily's struggle. He thanked the shopkeeper and continued his search, his resolve strengthening with each step. As night fell, Henry found himself sitting on a park bench, exhausted and no closer to finding Emily. The harsh reality of sleeping rough hit him as the temperature dropped, and he pulled his coat tighter around himself. For the first time, he truly understood the daily struggles Emily and others like her faced. The next morning, with dark circles under his eyes and a newfound empathy in his heart, Henry joined a group of volunteers at a local soup kitchen. As he ladled out portions of steaming soup, his eyes constantly scanned the faces of those in line, hoping to catch a glimpse of Emily. Suddenly, his heart skipped a beat. There, at the far end of the room, was a familiar silhouette. "Emily," he called out, abandoning his post and rushing towards her. But as quickly as she appeared, she vanished into the crowd. Henry pushed through the mass of people, desperately trying to catch up, but it was too late. She was gone. Dejected, Henry slumped against a nearby wall. His phone buzzed. It was his lawyer. "Henry, we need to talk. Michael's making moves, and it's not looking good. With a heavy sigh, Henry listened to the update, his mind split between the legal troubles brewing and his desperate search for Emily. After ending the call, he decided to visit a women's support center, hoping they might have information about Emily's whereabouts. The center was a haven of warmth and understanding, a stark contrast to the cold streets outside. As Henry explained his situation to the sympathetic staff, he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt for his initial mistrust of Emily. With no new leads and the day waning, Henry found himself standing on a bridge, looking out over the city. The twinkling lights below seemed to mock his failure to find Emily. But as he watched the resilient city pulsing with life, a renewed determination filled him. He would not give up. Exhausted and emotionally drained, Henry finally returned to his apartment. As he approached his door, something caught his eye, a small piece of paper tucked into the frame. With trembling hands, he unfolded the note and read its contents. As Henry's eyes scanned the words, his heart raced. The note read, "Emily will be in Central Park at dawn tomorrow. This is your last chance." The pre-dawn air was crisp as Henry made his way through Central Park, his heart pounding with anticipation. He had barely slept, the anonymous note burned into his memory. "Emily will be at Central Park at dawn. This is your last chance." As he approached the agreed-upon location, the first rays of sunlight began to peek over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the lake. Henry's eyes scanned the area, searching for any sign of Emily. Then he saw her. She was sitting on a distant bench, her posture rigid and her gaze fixed on the water. Taking a deep breath, Henry approached cautiously, his footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path. "Emily," he called out softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She turned, her face a complex tapestry of emotions, surprise, hurt, and anger all vying for dominance. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the weight of their last encounter hanging heavy between them. Henry took a step forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Emily, please. I know I hurt you, but if you just let me explain, Dash." Before he could finish, Emily stood abruptly, her eyes flashing with renewed anger. Without a word, she turned and began to walk away, her pace quick and determined. "Emily, wait," Henry called out, his voice tinged with desperation. He began to follow her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "I was wrong. I made a terrible mistake, and I'm so sorry. Please, just give me a chance to explain." Emily continued walking, her stride never faltering. Henry persisted, weaving through the park's winding paths, his pleas becoming more urgent with each step. Other early morning parkgoers watched the scene unfold with curious glances, but Henry paid them no mind. His focus was solely on the woman in front of him, the woman he had wronged so terribly. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Emily stopped. She whirled around to face Henry, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Explain what, Henry?" she spat, her voice trembling with emotion. "How you were so quick to believe the worst of me. How you threw me out without even giving me a chance to defend myself. Do you have any idea what that felt like?" Henry flinched at her words, each one a well-deserved blow. "I know," he said softly, his head bowed in shame. "I let my past cloud my judgment. I was scared, and I reacted in the worst possible way. But Emily, I dash." He was cut off by the sudden, shrill ringing of Emily's phone. She glanced at the screen, her expression shifting from anger to concern in an instant. "Hello," she answered, her voice tense. Henry watched as she listened, her face growing more worried with each passing second. "I'll be right there," Emily said hurriedly before ending the call. She looked at Henry, conflict evident in her eyes. "What's wrong?" Henry asked, his own concerns momentarily forgotten. "It's the shelter," Emily replied, already starting to move. "There's some kind of emergency." Without thinking, Henry fell into step beside her. "I'm coming with you," he said firmly. Emily looked like she wanted to argue, but the urgency of the situation won out. They ran together through the park, their earlier confrontation temporarily set aside in the face of a greater crisis. As they approached the shelter, they could hear the commotion before they saw it. Residents were gathered outside, their faces etched with worry and fear. Emily pushed through the crowd, Henry close behind. "What's happening?" Emily demanded, addressing a group of visibly distressed women. One of them, an older woman with graying hair, stepped forward. "They're saying we have to leave," she said, her voice shaking. Some men came with papers talking about demolition and development. Emily's face paled. "What? That's impossible. We have agreements in place." Henry, meanwhile, had caught sight of the documents being waved around by a suited man near the entrance. His blood ran cold as he recognized the logo on the letterhead. It was Michael's company. "Emily," he said quietly, touching her arm to get her attention. "It's Michael. He's behind this." Emily's eyes widened in realization, then narrowed in determination. She strode towards the men with the papers, her chin held high. "Excuse me," she said firmly. "I'm one of the coordinators here. I'd like to see those documents." As Emily engaged with the men, her voice calm but authoritative, Henry couldn't help but marvel at her composure. She was in her element, fighting for these people, showing a strength and leadership that he had only glimpsed before. The confrontation grew heated, with the men from Michael's company growing increasingly agitated by Emily's questions and challenges. Henry stepped forward, placing himself between Emily and the increasingly aggressive men. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his years in business, "I suggest you take a step back and reconsider your approach. I have some questions about the legality of these documents, and I'm sure my lawyers would be very interested in reviewing them." The mention of lawyers caused the men to hesitate, exchanging uncertain glances. Emily used the moment to rally the shelter residents, organizing them into a united front against the threat of eviction. As the standoff continued, Henry found himself constantly glancing at Emily. He saw her in a new light, strong, compassionate, and fiercely protective of those under her care. He realized with a pang of regret how much he had underestimated her, how quickly he had jumped to conclusions based on his own fears and past traumas. The confrontation eventually ended in a stalemate, with Michael's men retreating for the moment, but promising to return. As the immediate crisis subsided, Emily began organizing the residents, assigning tasks and offering reassurances. Henry, feeling out of place but determined to help, approached Emily cautiously. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked. Emily regarded him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded towards a group of women who were trying to move some heavy furniture. "They could use an extra pair of hands," she said, her tone neutral. As Henry moved to help, his eyes caught sight of a poster on the shelter's bulletin board. It advertised a job opening in another city, and Emily's name was circled in red pen. While Emily continued to ignore Henry, he noticed a job posting on the shelter's wall for a position in another city, with Emily's name circled. Henry's eyes fluttered open, his back aching from the uncomfortable floor of the shelter. The events of the previous day came rushing back to him as he sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He had spent the night helping the residents, trying to make amends for his past mistakes and desperately hoping to catch a glimpse of Emily. As he stretched and looked around, his gaze fell upon a job posting on the wall. His heart sank as he noticed Emily's name circled in red. Approaching the board, he studied the details of the position in another city, feeling a sense of urgency growing within him. Emily walked in, her eyes darting away when she noticed Henry. He seized the opportunity to speak with her, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "Emily, about that job posting." She cut him off abruptly. "It's none of your business, Henry." Her tone was cold, but he could sense a hint of uncertainty beneath her words. Undeterred, Henry pressed on. "Please, just hear me out. I know I made a terrible mistake, but I'm trying to make things right." Emily's shoulders slumped slightly, but she remained silent, neither confirming nor denying her interest in the job. Henry took this as a cue to continue. "I've been making calls to my lawyer. We're looking for ways to stop the demolition. There has to be a legal loophole we can exploit." For the first time since their confrontation, Emily's eyes met his. There was a flicker of hope, quickly extinguished by doubt. "Why should I believe you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Henry could respond, the shelter erupted into chaos. Word had spread about the impending demolition, and panic was setting in among the residents. Emily immediately sprang into action, her leadership skills on full display as she began organizing a peaceful protest. Henry watched in awe as she rallied the residents, her passion and determination shining through. He couldn't help but reflect on how badly he had misjudged her. As he observed her in her element, a memory surfaced, the day he first met Michael. The parallels between that encounter and his current situation with Emily were striking, and it filled him with a sense of dread. Shaking off the unsettling feeling, Henry joined the fray. He positioned himself between the approaching construction crew and the shelter's entrance, his heart racing, but his resolve unwavering. "You can't do this," he shouted at the foreman, who looked more annoyed than intimidated. "There are people living here, people who have nowhere else to go." The commotion attracted the attention of a local news crew, who began filming the confrontation. Emily, seizing the opportunity, stepped forward to give an impassioned interview about the importance of the shelter and the lives that would be devastated by its destruction. Henry couldn't help but admire her eloquence and conviction. As he listened to her words, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The caller ID made his blood run cold. It was Michael. "You're making a big mistake, Henry." Michael's voice dripped with venom. "I will destroy you if you don't back off." The threat hung in the air long after Henry ended the call. He felt the weight of his past pressing down on him, threatening to crush his newfound determination. In a moment of vulnerability, he found himself confiding in one of the shelter's residents, an older man named Frank. "I've made so many mistakes," Henry confessed, his voice cracking. "I don't know if I can fix this." Unbeknownst to Henry, Emily had paused nearby, overhearing his raw admission. Her expression softened slightly, a crack appearing in her armor of distrust. As if struck by lightning, Henry suddenly straightened up, an idea forming in his mind. He excused himself from Frank and rushed to make a crucial phone call. Within the hour, he had assembled a group of local investors for an impromptu meeting at the shelter. While Henry was presenting his audacious plan to save the shelter, Emily's phone rang. It was the callback she had been waiting for, confirmation of the job offer in another city. As she listened to the details, her eyes drifted to Henry, who was gesticulating enthusiastically to the group of potential investors. The air in the shelter was electric with possibility and uncertainty. Henry and Emily's gazes met across the room, both acutely aware that they stood at a crossroads. The decisions they made in the coming hours would shape not only their own futures, but the lives of everyone in the shelter. As the demolition crews edged closer and Emily's deadline for accepting the job offer loomed, Henry's phone chimed with a message. His breath caught in his throat as he read the words on the screen. "I have proof against Michael. Meet me in an hour where it all began." Henry's heart raced as he approached the building where his former company with Michael had begun. The message burned in his mind. "I have evidence against Michael. Meet me in an hour where it all started." As he entered the lobby, memories flooded back. The excitement of their early days, the dreams they'd shared, and the bitter taste of betrayal that followed. A figure emerged from the shadows, and Henry's hand instinctively tightened around his phone. "Henry Caldwell?" the man asked, his voice low and cautious. "Yes, that's me. You said you had information about Michael." The man stepped into the light, revealing a face etched with worry. "I'm Jake, Michael's former assistant. I've been wanting to come forward for a long time, but I was afraid. What's happening with the shelter? I couldn't stay silent anymore." Jake reached into his jacket and pulled out a small flash drive. "Everything's on here. Financial records, emails, the whole corrupt scheme between Michael and Carol. It's worse than you think, Henry." With trembling hands, Henry took the drive. "Why are you doing this, Jake?" "Because what they're doing is wrong. And because I remember when you and Michael started this company, how passionate you both were about making a difference. I guess I hope that spirit still exists somewhere." Henry nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "Thank you, Jake. I promise I'll make this right." As Jake disappeared into the night, Henry rushed to his car, his laptop balanced precariously on his knees as he inserted the drive. Document after document flashed across the screen. Falsified contracts, offshore accounts, evidence of bribery. Henry's shock turned to determination as he scrolled through years of deceit. Without hesitation, He dialed his lawyer. James, it's Henry. I need you to look at something right away. We're going after Michael, and we're going to stop this demolition. The drive back to the shelter was a blur. Henry's mind raced with possibilities, strategies forming and dissolving as he navigated the late-night traffic. He burst through the shelter's doors, out of breath and eyes wild with urgency. Emily, he called out, scanning the room frantically. Emily, where are you? He found her in the makeshift office, surrounded by worried residents. The atmosphere was thick with tension. News of the final eviction order had spread quickly. Henry, Emily's voice was a mix of surprise and lingering distrust. What's going on? Before he could respond, a commotion at the entrance drew their attention. Officers were posting the final eviction notice, their faces a mask of indifference to the panic around them. Henry stepped forward, his voice steady. Officers, I'm requesting an immediate stay on this eviction. We have new evidence that calls into question the legality of this entire process. The lead officer frowned. Sir, we have our orders. Unless you have a court injunction, you'll have one within the hour, Henry interrupted, already dialing his lawyer again. In the meantime, I'm invoking my right to challenge this order. These people aren't going anywhere tonight. As Henry argued with the officers, he could feel Emily's eyes on him. The mistrust was still there, but something else too, a glimmer of hope, perhaps even admiration. When the officers finally left, promising to return if no injunction was filed, Henry turned to face the shelter's residents. I know you've all been through hell, and I'm partly to blame for that. But I promise you, right here and now, that I'm going to make this right. We're going to save this place. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Emily stepped forward, her gaze intense. Henry, what's really going on? What evidence are you talking about? Before Henry could answer, the door burst open again. Carol strode in, her face a mask of false concern. Emily, dear, I just heard about the eviction. I came as soon as I could. You can't trust Henry, you know. He's just trying to save face after everything he's done. Emily's eyes darted between Henry and Carol, uncertainty clouding her features. It was a moment of decision, and Henry could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. Emily, he said softly, I know I've given you every reason to doubt me, but please just let me show you what I found. Give me one last chance to explain everything. The tension in the room was palpable as Emily considered her options. Finally, she nodded. All right, Henry, show me. With shaking hands, Henry connected his laptop to a projector. As the documents flashed across the makeshift screen, gasps and angry mutters filled the room. Emily's eyes widened in shock as she saw the extent of Michael and Carol's deception. Carol's face drained of color. This is all a misunderstanding, she stammered, backing towards the door. But the shelter's residents, fueled by anger and betrayal, blocked her path. Emily, Henry said, his voice thick with emotion, I know this doesn't erase what happened between us, but I hope it shows you that I'm trying to make things right. I want to help, truly help, if you'll let me. For the first time in days, Emily's face softened. Okay, Henry, let's talk. As they moved to a quieter corner of the shelter, Henry felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. There was still so much to do, so many wrongs to right, but this moment, this chance to finally explain everything to Emily, felt like the first real step towards redemption. They had just settled into a secluded spot when Emily's phone rang. She glanced at the screen, her expression suddenly conflicted. It's about the job in another city, she whispered. They're asking for my final answer right now. Henry's heart sank as Emily answered the call, her future, and possibly his, hanging in the balance of this one conversation. Emily's phone buzzed insistently, breaking the tense silence that had fallen between her and Henry. She glanced at the screen, her expression tightening. It's about the job, she murmured, hesitating before answering. Henry watched, his heart pounding, as Emily spoke quietly into the phone. I understand. Yes, I appreciate the opportunity. I just need a little more time to decide. Is that possible? She paused, listening. Thank you. I'll let you know as soon as I can. As she ended the call, Emily turned to Henry, her eyes searching his face. We need to talk, she said softly. Really talk. Henry nodded, feeling a mix of fear and hope. They found a quiet corner of the shelter, away from the bustle of worried residents. For the first time since their reunion, Henry opened up completely, laying bare the wounds of his past, the betrayal by Michael, and the walls he had built around his heart. "I was so scared of being hurt again," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "I let that fear cloud my judgment, and I hurt you in the process. I'm so sorry, Emily." Emily listened intently, her expression softening as Henry's story unfolded. When he finished, she reached out and tentatively took his hand. "Thank you for trusting me with this," she said. "I understand better now, but trust is a two-way street. We both have work to do." As they sat there, hands clasped, an idea began to form in Henry's mind. "What if we could save the shelter and create something even better?" he asked, excitement creeping into his voice. "A women's support center with resources for job training, counseling, and—" He paused, looking at Emily meaningfully. "A bakery." Emily's eyes widened. "A bakery?" she whispered, a spark of her old passion igniting. "Your bakery," Henry clarified. "The heart of the center. We could combine my business resources with your dream, create something truly special." For the next hour, they brainstormed feverishly, their previous tension melting away as they worked together. Emily gathered the shelter residents, presenting the idea with growing enthusiasm. The response was overwhelming, with residents offering suggestions and pledging their support. Henry found himself making call after call, reaching out to old contacts and potential investors. Each conversation filled him with renewed purpose, but he knew the hardest call was yet to come. "I need to confront Michael," he told Emily, his voice trembling slightly. Face to face. Emily studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You're not alone in this," she said firmly. "I'll be right there with you." The meeting with Michael was set for the following day. That night, as they prepared their presentation for potential investors, Henry felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. Working alongside Emily, seeing her passion and determination, he realized how much he had underestimated her and himself. The next morning, they visited 3 potential investors before noon. Emily's genuine enthusiasm for the project was infectious, and Henry found himself speaking with a conviction he thought he had lost. By the time they reached the city council meeting, they had 2 tentative commitments and a growing sense of momentum. The council chamber was packed, with shelter residents and community members filling every available seat. Henry and Emily presented their vision for the Women's Support Center, emphasizing the positive impact it would have on the community. Just as they were wrapping up, a commotion at the back of the room drew everyone's attention. Michael strode in, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "This is all a sham," he shouted, pointing an accusing finger at Henry. "He's using this project to cover up his own misdeeds." The room erupted in chaos, but Henry felt a strange calm settle over him. He looked at Emily, saw the unwavering support in her eyes, and knew what he had to do. "I have evidence," Henry announced, his voice cutting through the noise. "Evidence that proves not only my innocence, but Mr. Reeves' involvement in multiple illegal activities." As Henry presented the documents Jake had provided, the mood in the room shifted dramatically. Michael's face drained of color, and he attempted to flee, only to be stopped by security guards. In the aftermath of Michael's very public downfall, Henry found himself emotionally drained. Emily guided him to a quiet corner, her hand warm and reassuring on his arm. "You did it," she said softly. "You faced your demon." Henry looked at her, seeing not pity but admiration in her eyes. "We did it," he corrected. "I couldn't have done this without you, Emily." The city council, impressed by their presentation and the unexpected turn of events, gave preliminary approval for the support center project. As they left the building, Henry and Emily were greeted by cheers from the shelter residents who had attended the meeting. In the midst of the celebration, Henry found himself standing close to Emily, the air between them charged with unspoken emotion. He leaned in, drawn by the warmth in her eyes, their lips just inches apart. "Henry! Emily!" a voice called, breaking the moment. They turned to see a reporter approaching, microphone in hand, eager for a statement about the day's events. As Emily stepped away to address the reporter, Henry's phone buzzed with a notification. His heart sank as he read the message. Michael had filed a last-minute lawsuit, threatening to derail the entire project. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Henry and Emily arrived, their faces a mixture of determination and apprehension. A sea of reporters surged forward, microphones outstretched, shouting questions that blended into a cacophony of noise. Henry instinctively placed a protective hand on Emily's back, guiding her through the crowd. "Mr. Caldwell, do you think you can win against Michael Harrington?" "Ms. Emily, how does it feel to be at the center of this controversy?" They pushed past, ignoring the barrage of questions, their focus solely on the battle that lay ahead. As they entered the courtroom, the gravity of the situation hit them full force. The room was packed, the air thick with tension. Michael sat at the opposing table, his face a mask of smug confidence. As the judge entered and the trial began, Michael's lawyer launched into a blistering opening statement, hurling accusations at Henry. "Your Honor, Mr. Caldwell is nothing more than a failed businessman trying to salvage his reputation on the backs of the homeless. His so-called center is merely a front for his own selfish interests." Henry's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists under the table. Emily reached over, giving his arm a reassuring squeeze. When it was their turn, Emily took the stand, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger with each word. "This center isn't just about providing shelter," she said, her eyes scanning the courtroom. "It's about giving people hope, a chance to rebuild their lives. I know because I've been there. I've felt the despair of having nowhere to go, no one to turn to. This center can change lives. It already has." As Emily spoke, Henry could see the impact her words were having on the jury. Even the judge leaned forward, captivated by her sincerity. When it was Henry's turn to present evidence, he approached the bench with a quiet confidence. "Your Honor, I have here documented proof of Mr. Harrington's illegal activities, including embezzlement and fraud." He presented the files, watching as Michael's face drained of color. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge called for order, his gavel echoing through the room. During a tense recess, Henry and Emily huddled in a quiet corner of the hallway. "You were amazing up there," Henry said softly, his admiration evident in his eyes. Emily managed a small smile. "We both were, but it's not over yet." As they returned to the courtroom, they were surprised to see it packed with familiar faces. The residents of the shelter had come en masse, filling the gallery with supportive faces. Their presence seemed to infuse Henry and Emily with renewed strength. Just before the final arguments, Michael approached Henry, his voice low and threatening. "It's not too late to back down, Henry. I can still make your life a living hell." Henry stood tall, meeting Michael's gaze without flinching. "No, Michael, it's over. The truth is out, and no amount of threats can change that." As Henry's lawyer delivered the closing argument, his words resonated through the courtroom. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about more than just a building or a business deal. It's about second chances, about redemption. Mr. Caldwell and Ms. Emily have shown us that it's never too late to right our wrongs, to extend a helping hand to those in need." Under the table, Emily's hand found Henry's, their fingers intertwining in a silent gesture of trust and support. The moment the judge announced he was ready to deliver his verdict, the courtroom fell into an unbearable silence. Henry could hear his own heart pounding in his ears. In the matter of Harrington versus Caldwell, regarding the proposed community center and support facility, this court finds in favor of the defendant, Mr. Henry Caldwell. The courtroom exploded in cheers. Henry and Emily embraced, tears of joy and relief streaming down their faces. As they turned, they saw Michael being led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. Emerging from the courthouse, Henry and Emily were greeted by a crowd of supporters. The residents of the shelter rushed forward, engulfing them in hugs and words of gratitude. Reporters clamored for statements, but Henry only had eyes for Emily. Back at the shelter, an impromptu celebration broke out. Music played, people danced, and for the first time in a long while, the air was filled with hope and laughter. Henry watched as Emily moved through the crowd, hugging people, her face radiant with joy. As the party continued around them, Emily pulled Henry into a quiet corner. Their eyes met, years of pain and struggle giving way to something new, something hopeful. Henry leaned in, his heart racing. But before their lips could meet, Emily placed a gentle hand on his chest. "Henry," she said softly, her eyes serious. "There's something I need to tell you about the job in another city." Emily's heart raced as she pulled Henry aside from the bustling celebration. The noise of the jubilant crowd faded into the background as she looked into his eyes, her own filled with a mix of excitement and nervousness. "There's something I need to tell you about the job in another city," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry's breath caught in his throat, fear flickering across his face. But before he could respond, Emily continued, "I turned it down." Relief washed over Henry, followed quickly by a surge of joy. Without thinking, he pulled Emily close and kissed her passionately. All the tension, all the misunderstandings, and all the doubts of the past weeks melted away in that moment. Emily wrapped her arms around his neck, returning the kiss with equal fervor. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Henry rested his forehead against Emily's. "I was so afraid I'd lose you," he admitted. Emily smiled softly. "I realized that everything I want, everything I need, is right here." The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity as they threw themselves into transforming the old shelter into a modern support center. Henry's business acumen combined perfectly with Emily's vision and compassion. They worked side by side, planning every detail of the center and the bakery that would be its heart. One evening, as they sat surrounded by blueprints and sample menus, Emily looked up at Henry. "Are you sure about this? It's a big change from your corporate life." Henry reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. It's given me a purpose I never knew I was missing." As the center began to take shape, they welcomed the first group of vulnerable women. Emily's eyes shone with pride as she led them through the newly renovated living quarters, explaining the various support programs available to them. In the gleaming new kitchen, Emily began teaching baking skills to the residents. Henry watched from the doorway, his heart swelling with love and admiration as he saw the way Emily connected with each woman, offering not just instruction, but also encouragement and understanding. "What should we name the bakery?" Emily asked one afternoon, flour dusting her cheek as she kneaded dough. Henry pretended to think hard. "How about Don't Give Up?" he suggested with a grin. Emily threw a handful of flour at him, laughing. "That's terrible. We need something meaningful, something that represents new beginnings." Their playful banter was interrupted by a call from Henry's lawyer. Michael wanted to see him. Henry's mood immediately darkened. "You don't have to go," Emily said softly, sensing his distress. Henry shook his head. "No, I need to do this. For closure." The visit to the prison was tense. Michael, stripped of his power and arrogance, seemed smaller somehow. Their conversation was brief and stilted, but as Henry left, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Emily was waiting for him when he returned, wordlessly enveloping him in a comforting embrace. "I'm proud of you," she murmured into his chest. As the grand opening approached, last-minute problems threatened to derail their carefully laid plans. A delayed shipment of essential equipment had them scrambling. "We can't open without ovens," Emily exclaimed, panic edging into her voice. Henry squeezed her hand reassuringly. "We'll figure it out. We always do." Together, they worked their connections, called in favors, and by some miracle, managed to get everything in place just hours before the opening. The day of the inauguration dawned bright and clear. The entire community had turned out to celebrate. As Henry and Emily stood before the crowd, hands clasped tightly, the mayor praised their vision and perseverance. "This center," the mayor announced, "is a testament to the power of second chances and the strength of our community." Henry looked at Emily, seeing his own joy and pride reflected in her eyes. As they cut the ribbon together, officially opening Rising Hope Bakery and Women's Support Center, the cheers of the crowd washed over them. Later, as they watched residents and community members mingle, sampling pastries and touring the facility, Henry wrapped an arm around Emily's waist. "We did it," he said softly. Emily leaned into him, a contented smile on her face. "We did, and it's just the beginning." As they basked in the glow of their achievement, neither noticed a familiar face in the crowd. A woman, her eyes fixed on Emily, slowly made her way through the throng of people, a look of determination on her face that suggested this new chapter in Henry and Emily's life was about to take an unexpected turn.